meeting. Okay, we scheduled this special meeting to, excuse me. We scheduled a special meeting to give the board space to receive and discuss the initial modeling results associated with a range of possible scenarios staff could implement for the draft forest management plan. Note for those tuning in, even with a quorum present, the board does not plan on presenting a motion or decision during this meeting. Okay, I've got one thing that I wanted to announce. That is a change in how the board will be handling public testimony going forward on the subject of the state HCP. Just since 2021, the board has received 4,988 emails about the state HCP. During our meetings, we have listened to 713 separate testimonies, mostly done in person, with some offered up online. Heartfelt and important for us to hear no matter what side. But mostly we have heard the same or very similar messages over and over and over. All told, we have spent over 23 hours on this subject in our public board meetings. And that doesn't include the many, many more hours board members like myself have spent in other meetings on this subject. So here's the rub, and where I beg for your understanding. This issue will not get settled soon. Understanding the importance of the subject, I have remained committed to allowing as much testimony as possible. But this board has a lot of other issues and business to attend to, and it is essentially impossible and impractical for us to continue as we have done in the past. We simply don't have enough time. So this is what I have decided. Given that we have the new modeling now before us, we will accept testimony as we have in the past in our January meeting, and we'll accept as much testimony as possible that we can fit into 2 hours. After that, we will adopt what's called a listening post model. The department will be soon announcing a couple of community meetings where public testimony will be encouraged and recorded. Then that testimony will be analyzed for new information and summarized and presented to the board. I know none of this is ideal, but I think the whole board will appreciate your understanding. And with that, I do want to say that we are scheduled for 2.5 hours today. It will be a hard stop at 4:30, no matter how things are going. So just everyone, please be aware of that. All right. I will do my best to try to keep us on time and on point while facilitating any questions from the presentation provided by department staff. As I will be turning over the reins to Kearns and West facilitator for our discussion with the Forest Lands Trust Committee today, I'll be doing that afterwards. Let me move on to roll call to confirm we can meet quorum. Board members, please unmute yourself as I perform this roll call, and as I call on you, please state your attendance as present by video. Liz Agpawa.
Chair Kelly, I am present by video.
Carla Chambers.
Present by video.
Dan Doimling.
Present by video.
Shonda Ferrari.
Present by video.
Joe Justice.
Present by video.
Brenda McComb.
Present by video.
I'll let the record show that all board members are present. Okay, well, let's move on to the first portion of the meeting, the State Forest Management Plan presentation by staff. Mike, are you and your staff ready to do that?
Yes, Chair Kelly, State Forester Mikamoto, members of the board, we are ready to proceed.
Go right ahead.
All right, let me just adjust my screen momentarily. Okay, so good afternoon, Chair Kelly, State Forester Mikamoto, and members of the board. For the record, my name is Michael Wilson, and I serve as the State Forest Division Chief. I'm joined today by Todd Herron, our Forest Resource Analyst, and Nick Palazzotto, our Biological Support Unit Manager. So the primary focus of our discussion today will be sharing the modeling results for the draft forest management plan. Our staff and consultants have been working very hard over the last 12 months to develop and refine the modeling for the draft FMP to help inform the policy decisions that the board faces. The agenda for today is we'd like to go over the scope of the modeling, spend some time talking about the modeling updates, including the yield tables and how that compares to previous comparative analysis results, the methods, assumptions, and uncertainties associated with the modeling, and then, of course, the modeling results, and then we will we'll proceed with our conversation with questions from you and then with conversation with FTLAC. So to begin with, the geographic scope of the modeling exercise encompasses all 640,000 acres that ODF manages west of the crest of the Cascades from the Columbia River to the California border. And this includes 614,000 acres of Board of Forestry lands and 26,000 acres of common school forest lands. As you can see on the map, the vast majority of these forests are concentrated in the northwest corner of the state, with smaller holdings distributed throughout the rest of the area. The time frame for the modeling is 150 years. Our primary interest is the next 70 years, of course, during which time the FMP will be implemented using the draft HCP. The reason we model for a much longer is to ensure that the sustainable harvest and other benefits can continue to flow to Oregonians beyond the 70-year permit term. Modeling is currently underway. Modeling has been done that will provide information on a range of scenarios that the plan under which the plan can be implemented. The information will be useful to establish the performance measures, targets, and trends, although we're not really directly addressing those today. So the first scenario, we have 4 different harvest scenarios. The first one being a maximum non-declining even flow of timber that can be sustained over time. So this is done at an administrative district scale. In other words, our various districts that you're used to hearing about, Astoria, Forest Grove, Tillamook, so forth, but also done at a larger geographic scale that groups the lands on the North Coast together. That's the Clatsop and Tillamook State Forests in their entirety. The forests in the central Willamette Valley, including the Sandy Am State Forest and the lands managed by the West Oregon District out of our Philomath office. And lastly, the Southern Oregon forest lands that are managed out of the Western Lane District. Although the goal is, was even flow for that and is a strict even flow. The second scenario, similar to number 1, but it has somewhat longer rotation targets to grow stands longer, to develop larger trees, to see how that works for carbon storage. The third scenario focuses on generating high net present value with an even flow. So it's basically somewhat of a cash flow model, but it is focused on net present value. The fourth modeling scenario is conducted, it's a maximum well, it's not really truly a maximum net present value. It's a net present value run that is designed to mirror the run that was done for the comparative analysis for the HCP. And so it focuses on getting net present value, but it is constrained in the same way that the comparative analysis was. It basically has a between model periods of model period is 5 years. Between those model periods, it only allows for about a 5% differential between model periods and only a 10% differential overall from the long-term harvest average. So while it is a net present value goal, it is heavily constrained. So as I mentioned, this is done at 2 different geographic scales, at both the district scale and this larger geographic region. However, scenario number 4 was only run at the geographic region scale. We'll talk a little bit more about that and the outcomes, but that was because it was solely a comparison for the comparative analysis. Now I'm going to turn it over to Todd, who will start to go through the modeling updates.
Thank you, Mike. Again, my name is Todd Heron. I'm the Forest Resource Analyst with the State Forest Division. And in that role, I do much of the growth and yield modeling, as well as preparing and running the forest planning model. So I'm going to touch on some of that, excuse me, the highlights of some of the key changes that we've implemented and some of the updates we've done to improve our modeling efforts overall. I'm going to try to stay fairly high level. There's quite a bit of material to get through. But I'll go into some detail on what are some of the important work that was done, and do my best to stay out of the weeds. If I skip over something of relevance to you, or you have further questions, I'm happy to do my best to address those, at the end of this presentation or in follow-up to today's meeting. So this table on this slide represents some of the key changes and differences between the modeling that was done for the comparative analysis and what we're presenting here today. The left being some of the key points from the comparative analysis, and the column on the right, the similar buckets using for the modeling that was done for this work. So of note, we've switched from what was called a linear programming model to what's generally termed a heuristic model. I'm going to touch on that a little bit more in a later slide. We've updated our forest inventory. For the comparative analysis, we were using data from the 2017 stand level inventory revision. We're now incorporating the 2021 update, which includes recent harvests, as well as the effects from the 2020 Labor Day fires. We've revised some of the harvest objectives for management within the HCAs related to Swiss needlecast and decadent hardwood stands. We've also implemented a northern spotted owl dispersal habitat criteria, which was had not been developed yet in the draft version or concept for the HCP when we did the comparative analysis. Updates to the what's called the ending inventory target, which helps ensure future sustainability, long-term sustainability of the plans, the solutions proposed by the model itself. And then the growth and yield calibration work, which I'm going to touch on more detail here briefly. And then important spatial updates that we do periodically related to roads to reflect recent operations or new information about operationally limited areas. And then finally, we've updated what we call our reforestation zones and the prescriptions for the planting that would likely be done following regeneration harvests, as well as we've updated logging costs and the delivered log prices to reflect more recent information. So moving on to the yield table work more directly, yield tables are one of the primary inputs into the planning model. They provide the necessary biometric information related to trees and development of forest stands through time. Yield tables provide the planning model with information on the starting inventory, estimates of growth and stand development for both the existing stands that are currently on the landscape, as well as the replacement stands that would occur after a regeneration harvest. Yield tables also provide the gross harvest revenue information, as well as important information about habitat outcomes. And so our past modeling efforts have really highlighted the need to focus on the yield tables, in particular the growth estimates. And so to that end, we've taken some time this past year to really dig in on some of the details there. So yield tables are developed using a forest growth model. A growth model takes in basic information about trees and site conditions, and then estimates the development of those stands through time. the growth models are also used to simulate the silviculture actions, thinning, and such, to produce estimates of stand response and harvest volume. In particular, the growth model that we use is called the Forest Vegetation Simulator. This was originally developed by the U.S. Forest Service, and within that framework, they've developed variants of the FVS model, and we're using primarily what's called the Pacific Northwest Coast variant, but also the North Cascade variant and the Southern Oregon variant. FVS is designed to predict growth across a fairly wide geographic range. In our case, for the PN variant, the range stretches from the Southern Oregon coast up through the Olympic Peninsula. So calibration is a necessary part of the work to ensure realistic local growth projections. And past work included calibration, but that was much of that calibration was pretty coarse scale. We didn't have a lot of available data to do a good job of dialing in those calibrations. And so that's what we've been focusing a lot of our energy on in the past few months. So the work we're presenting today represents a considerable improvement in our use of the available data, as well as the methods that we employ for calibrating these FVS projections. One of the core data sets that we're using is from the Forest Information and Analysis Unit. This is plots that are spread out across the U.S. And managed by the Forest Service to maintain a national level forest inventory program. So in recent years, FIA has completed a full remeasurement cycle of plots within our region. And so by leveraging this data, our expectation is that our projections and reporting will be better aligned with region-wide efforts related to forest change and growth. And you may recall, in recent years, we've partnered with FIA to densify these FIA plots on state forest land. However, these new plots have not been remeasured yet, so they're not incorporated into much of this work. So to recognizing that there's not enough data directly on state forest land, we've incorporated plots from a 3-mile radius within state forest ownership, and then 10 miles for some important minor species. In addition to that, we're making better use of our internal stand level inventory measurement data. This data set has some limited utility that we've mentioned in the past, but it does represent the breadth of stands as they occur across our landscape. Okay, so next slide, I'm going to demonstrate some of the calibration work that was done to address some of the issues that we found with FVS. So we worked with a biometrician with Mason, Bruce, and Gerard to compare the growth estimates from FVS directly with the 10-year remeasurement data at the tree level from the FIA plots themselves, and then develop some correction methods to compensate for any of those differences. So this slide demonstrates the types of differences that were found and the adjustments that were made to correct for the differences. The analysis looked at differences in estimates by tree diameter class, which is represented on the x-axis. So 0 to 6 inch diameter trees, 6 to 12, and so on and so forth. And then the y-axis, the vertical axis, represents the average 10-year increment of those trees. So starting with the blue bars that you see on your screen, this is the estimate directly out of FVS without any calibration. The next set of graphs or bars, excuse me. The light yellow bars indicate the average diameter increment for those diameter classes as measured on the FIA plots. And then finally, the calibration work that we did arrived at FVS estimates that are much more in line at the tree level with the FIA plot measurement data. So that was tree level information, but that's only part of the story, right? So we need, for growth and yield, we need to be able to project these trees for 150 years in our case. So extending beyond the individual tree growth increment required some further analysis. Like I said, the diameter and height growth modifiers worked well to improve the estimates for individual trees, but due to interactions within the FVS model, stands that are projected for a longer period of time tend to drift further and further from the real world expectations. So to address this, we again leveraged the FIA plot data, but in this case, not for the incremental growth, but as evidence of the long-term productivity of the forests across the ownership. And so in addition to that, like I said, we also used field measurements from our SLI inventory database. So this data represents our best available data that holistically demonstrates the current potential growth of the forests of our forests. There are some caveats to using this data. Some of those include clearly many of these stands and plots have been managed, and so we need to recognize that not all the information on growth is present in the data. This is there's thinning removals that need to be accounted for. It also implies that future management and growth patterns will be consistent with past growth as represented in the plot data. And then finally, there's a lack of data in older stands. We don't have a lot of older stands on the landscape to draw from, and that may be somewhat limiting in all of this analysis. So to compensate for some of the management history, we were able to take the SLI data, which on the graph in front of you is the blue boxes, and we were able to make some adjustments for past thinning. And so that's why the blue boxes are a little bit higher in the middle age classes relative to the FIA data, which is represented by the yellow boxes. And so this chart characterizes the volume, if you will, the volume for stands across age classes as represented in the plot and stand data. And so from this data, we were then able to fit what we're calling guide curves or empirical yield curves to inform the calibration. The dash lines on the chart are curves representing from bottom to top the 50th, 75th, and 90th percentile of the field measurement data. And so these empirical yield curves were then used to qualitatively assess the results of the overall calibration. The 50th percentile represents, so the 50th percentile curve represents approximately half of the volume that could be achieved by half of the stands across the forest. 75th would represent 3/4 of the stands in the data. And then the 90th percentile really starts to represent those more extreme conditions that are present on the landscape, but occur more infrequently. And so the sequence here represents the calibration as it's applied, as it has been applied kind of chronologically. The first set of green boxes represent the FVS projections without any calibration. So clearly, these FVS projections are are way outside of the the expected range of future yield. The next step in the sequence is a more moderate calibration which is partially partially what was used in the comparative analysis. So this adjusts for what's called the maximum stand density index. It helps bring the projections closer to reality, but clearly there's some overestimation still occurring relative to what our expectations are. And so then finally, after we've applied the full suite of calibrations, so this is the diameter increment adjustments that we worked on with MBG, the height increment adjustments, and then the subsequent analysis, which looked at the development of the top height of the stand, as well as some additional defect adjustments, if you will. So it's just some more final adjustments to bring those estimates into a line. So overall, the final calibration is a pretty reasonable representation of the data that we have available. And we generally feel like these are pretty realistic. Okay, so rightfully there is concern about the confidence in all of this, confidence in the growth model projections generally. And so, generating realistic confidence intervals is difficult for a large scale analysis. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of unknowns, and would be a great undertaking to do a complete job of this. So that there are many factors at play that need to be considered, from the stand sampling, the inventory data, measurement error, imputation, site productivity, and other variables and assumptions embedded in the growth modeling. And then finally, in addition, the planning model that's used, whether it's a linear programming or a heuristic, typically do not have a mechanism to incorporate this uncertainty directly. So even if we could describe it, we wouldn't necessarily have a mechanism to leverage it. However, given what we know about the model and how it performs, there are a few things that we can do to help describe the confidence and to understand some of the uncertainty in the growth modeling process. So this chart leverages the SLI data in a method similar to what was used for developing the empirical yield curves from the previous slide. So the blue and the gray bands represent the range of uncertainty in those empirical yield curves, the blue being the 50th percentile curve and this gray being the 75th percentile curve. And so this chart is expressing those growth curves in terms of what's termed the mean annual increment for board foot volume, which is a key measure of productivity, forest productivity. And so MAI is the average growth, in this case the average board foot growth per year over the life of the stand, and the culmination of mean annual increment, the peak of the curve, is commonly referred to as the biological rotation. So overlaid on top of this is the results from the yield tables when all is said and done. So after everything's compiled, and the black lines, the dotted black line and the solid black line, represent the current yield tables, the latest revision, the solid line being the existing stands projected through time, and the dotted line, the dotted black line, being the regeneration stands that would be applied after future harvest. The red lines, by contrast, are the yield tables that were used for the comparative analysis. So there's some key differences here. Most notably, the regeneration prescriptions represented by the red dotted lines are well within the 75th percentile of the the stand data that we have. So clearly there, it's perhaps overly optimistic relative to the data that we have available to work with. And then the gray box represents the typical age range of regeneration harvest that's selected by the model, just to give an idea of where harvest occurs across the landscape relative to the uncertainty in those yield curves. Okay, so there's a fair bit to unpack in there, but I'll move ahead here. So moving on to the planning model, the model we used for the comparative analysis is what was referred to as a linear programming model. This type of model aims to find the optimal schedule of harvest and management that maximizes a singular objective, subject to constraints. So in the case of the comparative analysis work, the objective was to maximize net present value, and then harvest levels were adjusted as constraints determined for each scenario. The linear programming works well for representing strategic plans and outcomes. However, the results were difficult to interpret, and you may recall there were some key adjustments that we needed to make in post-processing to accommodate for some of those inconsistencies. So for the current modeling, we wanted to get back to something that was a little bit more spatially explicit, that could be evaluated against more of the real world constraints that our forest operations are subject to. So the tool we are using is it's a commercial product called Patchworks. And so Patchworks is a heuristic, what's called a heuristic modeling approach, which follows a set of rules to simulate harvest and management decisions across the landscape and through time. The model itself is guided by a set of targets and weights. So this is harvest level, revenue objectives, and so forth. And these are combined into what's called an objective function. So through the simulation process, the model then tries to find a solution to the harvesting schedule that gradually improves on the objective function until there's simply just diminishing gains in the improvements that are found. So in this case, in this sense, the solutions are what we call high quality, but they're not necessarily guaranteed to be the optimal in a strict sense, as with an LP type model. So we have previous experience with this model. We used it for the Western Lane IP project, as well as past forest management planning efforts. And so we were able to leverage a lot of that work and experience in this project. So in addition to the fundamental changes in the forest planning model, we've also incorporated the habitat suitability indices that were developed for the HCP for 3 species: the northern spotted owl, marbled murrelet, and the red tree vole. These HSIs are projected through time using the stand attributes from the yield tables. The indices, the HSIs themselves, describe relative habitat conditions and show current and future locations of sustainable or suitable habitat on the landscape. So some of the other important updates had to do with timber prices. So we're using average stumpage. Let's see, for timber prices. So we're using average delivered log prices by species from the period 2012 to 2022. these prices were adjusted for inflation, and then we're using the 10-year average of that. Let's see. Costs were updated based on district input and expectations for future costs. Let's see. Net present value for those runs we're using a 4% discount rate for the scenario 3, and then a 3% discount rate for scenario 4. So we're using the 3% because that's what was used in the comparative analysis, and we wanted to keep that reasonably consistent. So some important notes regarding the modeling. We're not incorporating any large-scale disturbance. We're not incorporating chronic stressors, whether it's drought or climate change. And there's also no stochastic components embodied in the model. So it would be speculative to account for future changes resulting from adaptive management. So we're assuming that the standards embodied in the draft FMP and HCP represent all of the constraints on management, and that they will be unchanged for the entire planning horizon. All right, so related to the assumptions and uncertainties, there's some key uncertainties related to the work that we do. Basic unknowns related to available acres. So these are there are some things about the landscape that we can't represent in entirety. So those are often discovered during operational planning. Actually, we're not accounting for disturbance. There's a certain degree of uncertainty in forest inventory generally. So that starting condition, it's let's see, changes in market conditions and costs. We can't very well predict future markets, inflation, or housing starts, et cetera, are difficult for us to incorporate into this scale of work. And we also can't account for any changes in future political environments or board directions. So we're maintaining the status quo, if you will. Okay, so the model data, there are some important considerations for goals and constraints. The model data itself identifies physical and operational constraints, as well as non-forested sites. Many of these sites are inoperable or inaccessible for management. For instance, steep or isolated parcels with no feasible logging method, areas that are too rugged for construction or helicopter logging, or too distant for helicopter logging. We're incorporating riparian conservation areas, campgrounds, roads, and so on. Many of these sites are forested, and they do contribute to the habitat and other goals. This slide represents noting some key constraints on the model. So even flow is an important consideration. So the even flow is imposed on the model to help ensure a predictable and sustainable harvest level through time. However, this does reduce the flexibility of the model. So there are some key considerations when using even flow as a constraint. One of those is that the model may tend to carry some excess inventory into the future that we may choose not to do, or make some other decisions that wouldn't necessarily be operational. I touched on the ending inventory constraint. That's a fairly big driver in the sustainability piece of the model puzzle. And then the net present value. So net present value versus the max even flow. The key differences there being under the net present value scenario, the model is aiming to maximize what's called the discounted cash flow problem. So this is related to the time value of money concept. And so even though it's constrained by even flow of harvest, it's going to attempt to maximize the near-term revenue generated by those harvests. So it'll seek out harvest units that are either low cost or high revenue in the near term. And then in contrast, the maximum harvest scenarios, the maximum volume scenarios, simply attempt to maximize the harvest, the delivered wood products over time within that even flow constraint. And then finally, related to the HCP, we have what are called the stay-ahead provisions for the covered species. So the stay-ahead provisions aim to ensure that habitat that is achieved on the landscape is retained over time. And then similarly, the addition of the northern spotted owl dispersal habitat requirement outside of the HCAs is there to ensure that the owls have appropriate levels of dispersal habitat across the landscape. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Mike, and he's going to touch on some of the outcomes from the model.
Thanks, Todd. So yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit now about the outcomes that you see in front of you here. So various conservation, economic, and social outcomes. And these aren't the only things, of course, that will be considered under performance measures. We've talked about it before. There's a number of things that are data sets that we currently do not have that will have to be developed, and some of them are a little bit more involved, like some of the social metrics, and trying to figure out how we want to manage those. But here are the ones that can come from the modeling that we've done. So I'll just go ahead and start moving into them. So first of all, I'd like to start out with a little bit of a comparison from the 2020 comparative analysis modeling and the similar scenario, that scenario 4, that we ran for this exercise. And this just kind of shows the differences from all of the updates. I'd say the single largest difference in this are the yield table calibrations. But of course, the model type has something to do with it as well. The constraints really haven't changed from that modeling. So you can see the departure here. Both models start higher than they end. So that it's a little bit smoother with the current modeling that we've done versus the comparative analysis modeling. I don't think there's a whole lot of takeaway there. I think the main thing is just the trajectory is similar, and also, just shows that delta between this and the previous modeling. So I think we can move on. So here are the actual figures for the outcomes, for the harvest outcomes. As you can see, the total annual harvest among all of the different scenarios, both at the georegion scale and the district scale, for the most part, they're not terribly different. One thing that's interesting, and I guess it just makes sense, is that to the maximum non-declining even flow of volume gets us the most volume over the permit period. That would be scenario 1, either at the georegion scale or the district scale. The one thing I would note there is that given how close those numbers are, 187.3 to 185, it definitely makes an argument in my mind that there's no reason to shift our planning focus to a georegion scale. It would be that much more difficult for our operations to have to flex like that, just in terms of where our employees and our offices are located versus where the work would go. for something that, for a range there that quite frankly is within the margin of error. Total annual net revenues, as you can see, there are, you know, mid 70s to I guess mid 80s at the highest, but generally speaking, somewhere around 80. Just for a comparison there, the average total revenues that we've had over the last decade, which have had some historically high markets and so forth, are 104 million. You can see the revenue, the annual harvest there from outside of the HCAs and inside of the HCAs is detailed, and that's a I want to be clear again, you know, the reason for managing in HCAs is not volume. However, when we provide these constraints to the model, it does basically use that as part of the volume equation. We'll look at that a little bit more as we go on. But during the first 30 years, the harvest that comes outside of the HCAs is shown, and the harvest that comes inside of the HCAs. Once 30 years passes and we are no longer managing in the HCAs, then the entirety of the total volume comes from outside of the HCAs. So that's just information there. Again, we'll look at that in a minute on a graph. The average rotation age is really pretty similar also across the different scenarios. We targeted an age of 100 years for the longer harvest rotation, the scenario 2. However, the average age turned out to be around 92. The average age for our standard maximum non-declining even flow of volume was 80 years in both cases. So let's look at the flow a little bit over time. And so as you can see, you know, this is not terribly surprising at the district scale. These were all basically even flow models. So there they are. They're all even. Scenario 1, again, that is most similar to what we do now, produce the highest volume over time. The other two were a lot more similar, the longer rotation in red, and then the non-declining cash flow in blue. And the next slide. So at the georegion scale, what we see is, again, they're all pretty even. Again, part of the objective there, part of the goal, except for that scenario 4 run that did have a departure associated with it. Again, just as we saw before, but relative to the other ones, starting at a little bit over 210 and then declining down towards 173 or so for the rest of the permit term. Okay, and so this shows the volume extracted outside the HCAs. So, and this is we're only showing this at the georegion scale, but obviously it's the same for the district scale. And this just shows the effect of having some of the harvest volume come from inside of HCAs during the first 30 years, and then all of a sudden it bumps up in model period 7 there to all be coming from outside of the HCAs. When we look at the county volumes, again, we're seeing not a whole lot of separation among the scenarios. The georegion scale doesn't really improve the outcomes, you know, so I think, you know, again, not a real reason to switch the planning scale. But we would note that, you know, obviously, some counties do better than others. And the stability also, what these numbers don't show is the flow over time. The stability for any given county, or the flow for any given county, varies. Counties with larger land bases tend to experience, you know, of course, more stable flow versus counties that have very few acres. You know, the harvest just doesn't come around as often under any scenario. And those specific county level outcomes are provided as an appendix to the modeling report that is in the board packet. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Nick to talk about the environmental outcomes.
Thanks, Mike. Chair Kelly, State Forester Mukomoto, members of the board, for the record, I'm Nick Palisato, Biological Support Unit Manager for State Forest. We were asked by the board to compare environmental outcomes of the model scenarios, including habitat for native wildlife and carbon storage. So for species covered under the Habitat Conservation Plan, we use the modeled habitat outcomes from the habitat suitability indices, which Todd mentioned earlier are derived from the inventory data in the model. For non-covered species, we use the changes in H-class distribution over time as a proxy for habitats associated with young and mid-cereal forest conditions. And for carbon, we use total stand carbon, which entails wood both above and below ground, and harvested wood products to obtain our estimates for each scenario. So to jump right in, for covered species, there are no differences among the model scenarios for habitat inside the conservation areas by default, essentially, because the scenarios are for harvest outside of the conservation areas. And this figure shows modeled habitat for spotted owls inside the HCAs over time, with acres on the y-axis and 5-year intervals on the x-axis. And the dotted orange line shows the HCP habitat commitments. So these modeled estimates show we have no issues meeting and maintaining the habitat commitments. And additional habitat beyond the commitments helps ensure we meet the stay-ahead provision for harvest of habitat, allows for some management activities in lower-end habitat inside the HCAs, and provides a buffer against both model uncertainty, models are imperfect, and changes to models over time. Will be continually improving our modeling effort, as well as natural disturbances like fire and windstorms. The modeling effort is yielding some different outcomes for habitat than the modeling we did for the comparative analysis. This is largely due to changes made to the yield tables, which in turn changed the value of the metrics underlying the habitat suitability indices. The differences are mostly minor, and we'll be working on recalibrating the habitat numbers with the Fish and Wildlife Service for their effects analysis. Modeled habitat outcomes for previous slide, please. Modeled habitat outcomes for red tree voles and murrelets are similar to those for spotted owls. I don't show them here, but they are in the report. Again, there are some differences among the covered species reflecting differences in parameters of their habitat suitability indices, but the overall trends are the same. So we meet the commitments, we meet them relatively early in the permit term, and we're able to maintain them with a buffer against various sources of uncertainty. Okay, next slide, thanks. Outside of HCAs, there's a commitment to maintain dispersal habitat for spotted owls, and that's defined here and in the HCP as stands with at least 40% canopy cover and an average DB diameter of breast height greater than or equal to 11 inches. The specific commitment is to maintain 40% of the areas outside of HCAs as dispersal habitat at any given point in time. And it's averaged at the georegion scale, where in this case, there's only 2 georegions. So the North Coast and then all other districts combined represent the 2 georegions. And this figure shows how dispersal habitat varies among the georegion scale scenarios, just presented here for simplicity. with percent of area in dispersal habitat on the y-axis and 5-year intervals again on the x-axis. And here the 40% commitment is the dotted black line below the scenario outcomes, which are the colored lines. And so this figure shows that we're able to meet the commitment and provide a dispersal capable landscape under all of the model scenarios. This isn't ultimately much of a constraint. Next slide, please. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, we're using the changes in forest age class distribution over time as a proxy for habitat for non-covered species not associated with late xeral forests. This figure shows the average age class distribution over the first 15 years of the permit term under each model scenario. So the y-axis shows acres and the x-axis shows age classes using 30-year increments, with 0 to 30-year-old stands on the far left and stands greater than 150 years old on the far right. The 4 bars within each age class are the different model scenarios, again at the georegion scale. And the solid portions within the solid portions of each bar are the area within HCAs, while the hashed areas are outside of HCAs, habitat conservation areas, sorry. This shows there's not much difference in age class structure among scenarios early in the permit term. Scenario 2, which is the longer rotation scenario, has slightly less young stands as more stands are held back for the longer rotations. And in general, this shows, as we often talk about, that state forests are still mostly young forests, as demonstrated here. And so habitat for early and mid-xeral associates is not lacking currently, while stands that are greater than 120 years old are relatively rare. Next slide, please. Okay. And this figure then shows average age class distribution in the last 15 years of the 70-year permit term. So we're looking out past 2080. It's 2080 to 2094. Again, the bars within each age class are the 4 georegion scenarios. Hashed portions are outside of HCAs, habitat conservation areas, and solid portions are inside of the HCAs. At the end of the term, there are a lot more acres in older age classes. Most of the area inside HCAs is 90 years old or older, and most of the area outside is younger than 90. Older acres outside, which are the hashed portions of stands greater than 150 or even say greater than 120 there on the right. These older acres outside come primarily from riparian conservation areas and other unavailable or inoperable acres. Stands 120 to 150 years old also include more available acres that the model didn't harvest within the 70-year permit term. Almost all of the stands under 30 and most of the stands under 60 will be outside of habitat conservation areas at the end of the term. And again, outcomes are not much different among scenarios, with the exception of scenario 2, which entails longer rotations. And so under that scenario, there are 25 to 40,000 acres fewer acres in the 0 to 30 age class, since some stands are held back from harvest for longer periods. So from a habitat outcomes perspective, this may be of biological significance to species whose habitats are associated with early xeral stand conditions. This would include many migratory bird species, big game. It might also affect local small mammal community composition and thus prey for raptors and other carnivores. And those are the habitat outcomes. I'm going to pass it back to Mike for carbon.
All right, great. Thank you, Nick. And you can see here with carbon outcomes, as you might expect, just given the graphs that you just saw, the charts that you just saw, and some of the other preceding information around rotation age, there's not a tremendous amount of difference in carbon among the scenarios that we looked at. It does include both carbon, tree carbon, total tree carbon, and also harvested wood products as well. I think, there's maybe a little bit of confounding results in here that don't make sense right away to folks. Around scenario 2, which is the longer rotation. I think that's just a function of where the inventory is at, and then also how carbon accumulates compared to Scribner volume that we're used to looking at in a tree. So not saying that the older trees don't store the carbon, but there is a difference in the rate at which they sequester the carbon. And so there's some more work to do there, I think, is the takeaway to better understand the more specific carbon trade-offs during implementation. And lastly, we'll just look at the ending inventory graph. Ending inventory is a pretty significant constraint in any model. And this is just for scenario 1 at the georegion level. We just picked one, but when we're looking at maximizing non-declining even flow of timber, obviously you can't really cut it all at once. So it will take actions to maintain inventory to ensure that it can harvest later. And it's a little bit hard to see, but if you follow the green, which is the general unmanaged forest, or sorry, general managed forest outside of HCAs, you will see that after the permit term, which is shown by the black line, it does start to cut into that a little bit more to get down to that ending inventory constraint. And this is just a good example of why we model for a longer period than perhaps the actual focus period here with the 70-year permit term, is because the model needs to be able to know it achieves that inventory further out and has sustainability. So with that, before the next part of the meeting, looks like we're about on time to have about, I guess, 20 minutes of time here that we could have questions from you all about these results.
Okay, that's we're talking about questions from the board members, questions and comments from the board members. Remember to identify yourselves for those who are following us online. Go ahead, Joe.
Sorry about that. Joe Justice for the record. Thanks for the presentation, guys. I wanted to, this question is probably for Nick. I wanted to dive a little bit into the outcomes related to habitat, northern spotted owl habitat. And I'd like to understand a little bit, as we initially created HCAs to generate habitat, that work was done quite some time ago, many years ago. And I'm assuming we had modeling to generate future habitat over the permit term. How does that differ from how we thought about this amount of habitat? I'm surprised by the excess habitat being generated within this model, and maybe I guess I'm just surprised about that we're generating so much habitat initially, or we have quite a lot of habitat initially, and then we're generating this amount of excess going into the future. I'm just trying to, can you just help me remember how we generated those HCAs initially, and also what your thoughts are about that excess habitat and the forecasted amount?
Yeah, so thanks for the record, Nick Palazzotto. So there were several criteria we used when we were creating the HCAs, and one of the larger drivers was current and historic occurrences for the covered species. So where we know they exist or have existed on the landscape in the past, which of course is a decent indication of habitat if you've seen them there. We also used, topography, LiDAR data, which showed us tree heights, which is also a good way to pick out habitat. Our inventory data, not just age classes, but other aspects of inventory, although age class was a big one. We also used a layer that we worked with that the field produced, the districts produced, that sort of typed out the ground, categorized the ground, production ground, considering a number of variables. So not just site index, it considered like distance to mills and type of logging and, et cetera. And it put ground into 4 separate categories from good to bad, basically. And so we used that, which drove some of what we did too, sort of considering on the landscape what types out as good and weighing that against the occurrence or habitat data that we had. And then once we had the habitat models, we went back and looked at how they played out in there. And it was we have data for sort of how much wound up inside and outside. And of course, using all of the data we did, much of the future habitat that grew fell inside the HCAs. So in terms of excess, I'm not sure it's the right way to frame it. The commitment itself was a negotiated agreement with the services around really a target. The commitment is to, ultimately the commitment is to the habitat that grows inside the conservation areas. The target, the sort of performance expectation, is the commitment level that we state therein. And so it's not an excess, it's in excess to essentially our minimum target level. There's other elements of the HCAs that are a little bit less tangible that were important in their design. And so landscape function through time is one of them. And so trying to create a network of areas for the covered species with redundancy as well. And so, redundancy, a key element of forest resilience and habitat resilience. And so not putting all your eggs in one basket and providing for hedging our bets against things like large fires or climate change inhibits our ability to produce habitat. The stay ahead is a big factor. It doesn't take long if you crank down on that habitat commitment to start pushing up against that stay ahead provision, which would make a challenge for future harvest. If we get constrained by, if we jump ahead, we get constrained. Another piece is, our populations on the North Coast have been historic, like since we first discovered them, have always been at low densities with poor productivity. And so it's more than just recreate the past. It's think about what a healthy population of spotted owls looks like on our landscape. So there's a enhancement element as well. And then also there's other covered species occurrence data. And so you add up all that stuff for owls, and then where there are other occupancy site, where there's occupancy by other covered species, it essentially is additive to the commitments you've made for owls.
So is it fair to say that you were trying to intentionally exceed the commitment?
No, the commitment was a post facto once we had a better understanding of what we had, like what the habitat conservation area. So we built habitat conservation areas that provide for biological, ecological function, et cetera. We looked at what we thought we would be able to grow through time. And then we lowered the actual commitment to an area that we were comfortable with. And another piece that might be relevant here is our experience with structure-based management and a key performance measure with the legislature, which was grow 20% in 20 years, which we then found out we couldn't for a whole slew of reasons. And so it's a hedge. It's a hedge against any number of things, and that's what I mean by model certainty. what if that model is over predicting habitat? Then we committed to its full extent, then we're over committing and we're not likely to meet the commitment.
But didn't the calibration of inventory also apply to modeled outcomes of habitat, correct? So you calibrated.
Maybe, let me try and answer, and Todd, correct me if I'm wrong. The models the indices are driven by our inventory data. And so you can generate a report, not like, separate from the report that you guys are looking at, a report from the program, from the model that tells you the habitat numbers through time. And of course, based on whatever model you're using, it's going to tell you slightly different numbers. We're working on them. I'm actually less concerned than I was at first glance because some of the numbers were bigger than they were earlier. As we look at it, it looks like we set some of the thresholds wrong. So we're literally just recalibrating them. And it actually looks relatively minor, even just in the last 5 days. When we met with FTLAC, we've refined the numbers since then.
Yeah, I know you. No, I understand you refine the numbers. I guess I'm going to circle back. I don't want to dominate the time here, but
it's an important question.
When we develop HCAs, we base that on information. You talked about that, Nick, as basing it. Is it fair to say that we didn't model future habitat as accurately as we're modeling it now? Is that a fair statement? When we were all the things that we
I see what you're saying. So given the improvements,
we have better data. All of this stuff we're getting, better and better. We're calibration. We're doing all these things to get, better and better information. And now we're forecasting a certain amount of habitat being developed over the permanent term.
Yeah. I don't know. I want to say yes, but the prudent side of me says you don't know until you see it, right? Intuitively, yes, that makes sense. We should see some improvements because we've improved the growth and yield data, as Todd just, demonstrated quite well. And so it should be more accurate. The numbers we've provided to date are not right. Quite. The spotted owl numbers have been updated. I'm more comfortable with those. I can see the red tree vole numbers that we made. We just picked the wrong threshold in the habitat index relative to the commitments that we made. And so it's over predicting for a very understandable reason. We dropped the bar. And so we just need to readjust that bar. And then the numbers are coming out similar, I would say. So for this, where we made the fixes in the spotted owl, you're winding up within 10,000 acres on either side, start and end, which seems, pretty reasonable margin of error. Feel free to clean up whatever mess I made, Todd.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, from my perspective related to the growth modeling and the habitat suitability indices, the work done to interpret the yield projections relative to the metrics that go into the HSIs themselves, to some degree was an expert opinion or an expert interpretation. So there's, as Nick described, there's some work to kind of reevaluate those.
But isn't there just hard and fast data that's informing growth and yield? I'm assuming diameter, height, tree distribution are all informing that habitat model. I'm assuming. I don't know what all the drivers are of that.
Correct. Yeah, the data coming out of the growth projections are very numeric data.
Mm-hmm.
It's the biological interpretation related to the HSIs that needs some better understanding, I suppose.
So this is a really important question. However, we've really only got about 10 minutes in this meeting left for board questions, and I've got 3 hands raised. So
yeah, I'll stop. I have a lot more questions surrounding that, guys. Just FYI.
I'll do, but we're pretty constrained by time here. We'll have I think we'll have a lot. We're going to have a lot of time with the FTLAC, so hopefully we can get to some of those other questions. But I'll move to Ben right now.
Thank you. Thank you all for the great presentation. And just real quick, so a little bit of a follow on Joe's question. So I'm troubled by the fact that you're not taking climate change or fire or those effects into account in the model. And I understand that modeling those unknowns are close to impossible, but I feel like the model that we're seeing is a sort of rose-colored glasses best case scenario that we know will not actually take place because climate change is real. Drought, heat, stress, fires are all headed this way to this forest, are playing a big role in this forest. And I guess I see the reason I see you taking that into account with the habitat of planning for that, knowing that it's coming. And I guess I'd ask, how can we do the same when it comes to harvest? Because I'd like to believe that those harvest numbers are going to be what they will be, but the reality is these are forests and forests change over time. So I guess I'm curious what we can do, the department can do over time to help us understand the real world's outcomes.
Yeah, this is Mike Wilson. I'll take that question. I think that, so fair, right? And it is very difficult to build those types of things into modeling. You can make certain assumptions in any given model run, but at the end, if you really want to explore variation, you're doing a bunch of Monte Carlo type simulations and all kinds of other cool stuff that we didn't have time for. But here's where I'm at with that. I think where to handle it is in implementation planning. So every time that we turn out a 10-year implementation plan, we do this same sort of modeling. And we do it for the same time horizon. We want to make sure that we don't make decisions in a decade that are going to undercut us in the long term. I think we have more room to explore that there. At this level, because we recognize changes are going to happen. And we did create that space with the HCAs. I mean, they are a conservation network first and foremost. The habitat numbers that are minimum expectations for the HCP take into account the uncertainty. But like you say, what about the volume and everything else? So I think what we have is a forest management plan that people talk about how broad it is and, oh gosh, there's not a lot of tangibles in there. It gives you that flexibility to change over time and other boards to set direction over time. And for us to just be able to do all the technical work. So it's this constant modeling, implementation, monitoring, feedback loop that helps us improve and do the adaptive management over time. Because I think right now we can make a lot of assumptions and, of course, we'd be wrong about a lot of them, right? Whereas I think when we start to look at it decade by decade, we start to learn in sort of that stepwise fashion. I think that we'll probably be in a better place. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Thanks, Mike. Let's move to Liz.
Hey, Lizette Power, for the record. Todd and Nick, thank you so much for all the modeling that you've done. And I was following on Ben's question. On one scenario, on the yields, we did not add in all those additional qualitative pieces, but on the HCAs, we took a gander at doing that. And so one is more qualitative and one is more quantitative. So my question is in this stay ahead scenario, which this is going to be my first question about, and I'm sure going to have many other questions about it. That was beyond what the commitment that was negotiated with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So how does one, and I've been in this situation before, how do you get your mind around something as qualitative sometimes as a, keeping ahead? And what were your considerations, Nick, when you did that? It's kind of a right brain, left brain thing. Can you just kind of give us a high view on that?
Yeah, let me know if I don't answer this right, but, so in the simplest sense, it's the stay ahead provision is the notion that your habitat on the landscape, your growth of habitat needs to exceed your harvest of habitat sort of through time. And so, part of the consideration is how much do we think we're going to be cutting? We cut, we harvest an average of 8 to 10,000 acres a year. And so you do that math, 5 years, you're at 40 to 50,000 acres. It doesn't take long, given the commitment is like 80,000, I think is what it's coming out right now for owls. It's different for the other species. The excess, so to speak. It doesn't take long to bump up against that where you're not where you're actually cutting more than you're growing. So that's the nature of that. That's the rub there. If you're planful, it doesn't ever become a constraint. If you cut the margins really close, one big fire and you're going to bump up against that. And now you lost the volume from the fire and you've got a slower pace to get back up to scale with your harvest or with your habitat growth.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Nick.
Okay, Carla, at least we can get started with whatever question you have, but we're going to be needing to move on in a couple of minutes. So go for it as quick as
I'll
possible.
just state my questions and I won't expect any answers here, but I'm back to where Joe started, that overestimated habitat. I have a lot of questions about that at the same time that yields went down by 25%. I think, when this whole thing started, the reason you go into an HCP is for certainty and to downsize risk. And it doesn't seem to me we've done either on this. You started with the 5,000 emails, 713 testimonials in 23 hours. I don't think we're done by any stretch of the imagination. But the fact that we went from harvest levels of 225 and 250, then we went down to 185, then we went down to 160 to 180, and now we're lower than that. Beyond just rural unemployment and mill closures that we are absolutely know are going to happen, and the revenue shortages to counties, the layoffs and revenue shortages to state lands and ODF's budget is equally of concern. So I want to get back to why we started down this road in the first place, which was to gain certainty and to reduce risk. And how do we get back on track and fix this? So we're coming back to those two original reasons we started down this pathway. And we can address those later, but those are my questions.
Thank you, Carla. Carla, you do throw a lot of numbers around, and sometimes I don't know where they come from. So I hope the department. I don't want for any of us when numbers are thrown out there for the department not to have a chance to speak to those. So in our further conversation, I hope we can, because I haven't seen numbers like what you've cited. So.
Jim, just hold on one second. I want you to look at ODF's actual state land numbers. There's a $59 million swing between the 5 years in the past and the current losses in 5 years. So I want you to look at their actual numbers and then add these losses to it and say, okay, how are we going to cover this? How do we cover the finances?
I want the department to be able to speak to that, but we're going to move on to the next part of this. Okay, so Mike, this is a good point for us to shift to the second portion of this meeting, and we want to welcome Chair Sweet and Vice Chair Scar and commissioners to this special meeting. So I believe we have everyone here. Would you like to introduce Sylvia, Mike, to get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm happy to introduce Sylvia Chiborowski from Kearns and West, and she's here to help facilitate this discussion between the board and FTLAC members. And so I think most of you know Sylvia from one meeting or another. So with that, I'll just turn it over to her and to open the floor for the discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike, Chair Kelly, State Forest Mikomoto, and the board and FTLAC. And for the record, I'm Sylvia Chiborowski. And like Mike said, I probably met most of you in some context or another, but for those who I haven't met, I've been working as process support and facilitation for a lot of the Western Oregon FMP and HCP committee and public and stakeholder meetings throughout the years. So I'm honored to be with you for this conversation with the board and the FTLAC as kind of a reflection on the modeling results and really to understand how the counties and board want to engage moving forward. You know, we all know the board here, you have a major responsibility in policy decisions for the management of state forests. And the counties, you have this great interest in making sure that the forests are managed, you know, for the benefit of your communities. And you've all had many conversations on this topic over the years. And today we really want to kind of focus on two key things, which is the reflections on the modeling results and thinking about how you all want to engage moving forward. If we go into the next slide, or sorry, this is the right slide. So as we walk into this conversation, I just want to acknowledge and kind of recommend some good guidelines for the next hour here together. I'll try to keep you all on track through facilitation, but would appreciate your help in kind of staying on topic and trying to hear from everyone and keeping things concise so that we can hear from everyone. And as you kind of ask questions and discuss, just making sure that you're really focusing on your interests and what matters to you and practicing your good listening, considering other perspectives. I know that all of you are here because you want to see good things happen on the landscape and in your communities. So really just assume that best intent with each other. All right, if we go to the next slide, this is kind of the purpose of our discussion today, which is really just to make sure that you all have as good of an understanding of the modeling as you can and kind of lay out some of the questions. And a lot of those will probably be answered offline, but just knowing what those questions are. And then also giving county commissioners an opportunity to figure out, you know, and have a conversation about what you need to know so that you can engage with the board moving forward. So in advance of today's meeting, we did develop some questions for consideration for discussion, and that was really guided by what the board was interested in hearing from FTLAC so that they can move forward and inform their thinking on the FMP and the HCP. So we'll kind of use those questions as a foundation for the discussion. So to begin, and again, like I said, we're kind of, maybe we can think of this conversation as two halves, one focused on the modeling results and, you know, questions and main takeaways from the modeling results. And then a second half focusing on, you know, how do the board and the FTLAC want to engage with each other to find solutions to manage these public lands. So for the first half, you know, I think I would like to maybe just invite the FTLAC members to kind of go around the table and hear from each of you in just a couple of minutes. You know, tell the board, what do you see as the key takeaways from the modeling and any benefits or concerns that you're seeing? And we know FTLAC, you all heard a presentation on the modeling last Friday and had a chance to ask some questions there, but I'm sure you didn't get all of your questions asked and you probably didn't make all your reflections. So just maybe this is another opportunity to do that. So I think if that sounds okay, I would turn it first to Commissioner Sweet as FTLAC chair and see if you want to just provide kind of 2 minutes on your key reflections from the modeling results. And then we can kind of go around the table with other FTLAC members. Commissioner Sweet, does that work for you?
Yes, it does, Sylvia. It's John Sweet, Coos County Commissioner and Chair of the Trust Lands. We'd like to change it a little bit. Each of us has kind of chosen to respond to one of the questions asked, and the others can add to it. But I'd like to ask Commissioner Magruder to respond to the first question. Do you have any clarifying questions about the modeling results?
Good afternoon, Margaret Magruder, Columbia County Commissioner. Thank you for allowing us to participate today. I find it very interesting that your reactions to this very lengthy and extensive presentation that the department has given was similar to what we how we reacted on Friday when we received this presentation. And we had lots of questions at that point in time. We sent questions to Mike Wilson, and he was very generous in his response to many of those questions. He sent us 15 pages, which we received, I believe, yesterday afternoon. And we have still to digest a lot of that information, which we will be reviewing, and we will, I know, have follow-up questions that we hope Mike and his team will respond to those questions also. We're happy with the willingness of the department and the board to work with us and engage with counties as we work to understand this data and the complexities of the report and the potential impact. So I will let the rest of the board, our board, the CFTLC board, respond to the remaining questions that were proposed. Thank you.
And again, Commissioner Sweet, any other members of the Trust Land Board have comments relative to the first question? And if not, I'd ask Commissioner Tucker to respond to the second question.
Good afternoon. It's Bill Tucker representing Lynn, Benton, Lincoln, Polk, and Marion counties, as well as Lynn. And the question was, are there any benefits or concerns that we'd have to discuss to relate to the modeling results? And absolutely, there are concerns as well as other benefits. But the concerns is where I'd like to look at one or two of them now to talk just for a second about them. We've had concerns throughout the process because each time we've seen modeling numbers, they trend downward, not always with the best of explanations. We're glad to see these results. It's nice to have waited a long time to see these numbers, but I'm not sure we have a lot of confidence. And then when we read the report and listened to the presentation, there was a lot of disclaimers and quantifications that were expressed in that makes us worrisome. Beyond that, the FMP model does not change the management targets of the state forest. It comes through the implementation plans. And oftentimes, and we have no assurance, the IPs will reflect this harvest level. Historically, for us, we've seen IPs that are lower harvest than the FMPs. I'd like to dig into one of the concerns a little bit deeper, which is the northern spotted owl acreage. From the results, and Mike, if you could you put up figure 9 from page 17? We see the HCP will produce even more spotted owl habitat than originally thought, and well above the commitment to the agencies. And shouldn't that result, we asked about that, cause a reassessment of the HCP? And this data, the response was that it is concerning, and they didn't understand quite how that occurred. But this is just one example. In this case, we now take a look at, if we wouldn't mind, Mike, we asked the question for you to ask about the spotted owl habitat area inside of or outside the HCA, but in the management area. So could you put the slide that you sent to us today?
Can someone stop sharing so that I can share, please?
Thanks, Mike. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No problem. I was ready for it. And let me just make this
zoom in a
little bit wider here. So this is the slide that we saw during the presentation, and this is, I believe, what you're referring to,
yep.
Mr. Tucker?
It is, because not only is there spotted owl habitat, there's also going to be spotted owl habitat inside and outside the HCA. So there's also spotted owl habitat. So we end up with about 2.5 times the commitment of spotted owl habitat being available. And when I think about the fact that that was the ending habitat commitment after the end of the time, I look at that and say that we're going to meet that inside the HCAs from the beginning. And when I look now at the Forest Service and I look at their 40 years history of shutting down federal lands for spotted owls, it didn't respond and it didn't result in spotted owl recovery. In fact, they now have to kill 400,000 barred owls just to slow, not to stop, just to slow the loss of spotted owls. And so I'm not sure how, by us creating all of this additional inside and outside of the HCA spotted owl habitat, is going to cause the restoration of the barred owls. And so these, I'm sorry, of the spotted owl, these numbers though are devastating to a county. It is an opportunity. I look at here that where we've met so much higher than the commitment, that this is an area that potentially some things could be put back into management. The report said they didn't have quite enough time they needed to look at this model, but I worry that when I look at work being done inside of the HCAs in the harvest tables, I worry that it's going to happen for Swiss needlecast, it's going to happen for alder, but I'm not sure it's going to happen in Lynn County when I ask those questions. So these state forests are moving quickly to what I think is a terrible decision for local economies. By looking at the Lynn County numbers, I'm going to lose about 12 million board feet compared to the 10-year average. And I'm sorry, 7 million board feet compared to my 12 million board feet average. This loss is about 87 jobs. For state forests, the 10-year average of 249,000 million board feet is down to like 160 to 180 range, depending upon where we end up being. But that's a loss of about 850 jobs. And I look at that and say that when I'm creating more habitat than I committed to, when it's that much larger, 2.5 times larger, is that what I want to have those jobs disappear for? So do I have concerns? I apologize, but I do.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks for laying that out and hearing those concerns around, wondering about the modeling results with their disclaimers and the habitat creation for northern spotted owl and worries about economy and job loss. I want to see if maybe we could have a little bit of a discussion on this, board members or other county commissioners, any other reflections on kind of those sets of concerns or what you're seeing?
Can we, prior to going into the
Sure.
discussion, can I offer a couple of clarifying points on that? I lost what I was. Are you guys still seeing the graph?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Oh, good. Now I am too. So sorry. So, I guess in a more simplistic way of saying this is, so we designed the HCAs basically to be that conservation network for the covered species so that we would adequately offset and mitigate for take outside of the HCAs. So I just want to put some clarification around that. The habitat commitment, the acres commitment, there's two things there. And this is one thing that we don't have well sorted out, is the difference between the high quality habitat and the suitable habitat. So that is one thing that we don't have sorted out yet with calibration with the new yield tables. That'll take some work. The other piece is we arrived at those acres, not because that was the target acres. The HCAs are the conservation network. We modeled and came out with a comparative analysis and said, it looks like we grow this much. However, we know that we may have disturbances and so forth that keep us from reaching that target, which will be that target, and also could interfere with us making our stay ahead requirement, as Nick pointed out as well. And so I just want to be clear that this habitat commitment was based on a minimum. So it's not necessarily the, I guess, the higher level objective. It does have uncertainty built into it. And if we didn't have HCAs as large as they were, and we go ahead and take that habitat and we lose stuff, then what do we fall back on? But I just want to provide that context as you move forward in your conversation. Thanks.
Mike, do you have another clarifying point before we move?
Yeah, that it speaks a little bit to what Carla said earlier as well. And so, we are growing habitat with or without an HCP, and that comes fundamentally to the sort of risk assessment that the board is called upon to do. The reason we're seeking is because we're growing it now, and we keep finding ourselves in lawsuits that tend to be impactful. We could make a decision not to grow habitat. The board could. They would have to weigh that against the full suite of GPV benefits, and against the risk of extirpating these ESA listed species. That's all.
Thanks, Nick. Let's go to Commissioner Bangs.
I'm going to be quick. I have a couple yes/no questions that just follow both Nick and Mike's statements. So I'm just curious, when was our last owl litigation that we had against the state of Oregon?
The last owl litigation that was threatened against us specifically was in the early 2000s. We managed to avoid litigation by coming to an agreement with potential plaintiffs and with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regarding habitat management for 10 years around a known spotted owl site.
Excellent. And then rather than front loading the plan with everything that you've just discussed, doesn't the HCP have an iterative tool that could be responsible to have responsiveness to both climate change and potential future conditions?
So there is adaptive management. There's an adaptive management component to all habitat conservation plans. The one thing that I would say about that is that, we cannot, you still cannot start with a minimum. How do you right size that? Is always a subject of debate, and people have a lot of different opinions on that. That's clear. But starting with the lowest possible place to get to your habitat commitments has a lot of risk associated with it when you don't. But
excellent. And then I guess my final is a statement for Clatsop County. And that statement is we haven't had a successful federal survey for spotted owls in Clatsop County for 7 years. So I'm just going to put that out into the ether. And as we continue discussing this and discussing what I consider overcommitment, there's that in the back of my head that I just needed to share. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Board Member McComb.
Yes, thank you. Question for Nick. Nick, let's take spotted owls for example. What are the variables that go into the HSI model?
Oh man, I got to pull it out, but it's trees per acre over 30 inches. It's the diameter diversity index. And then it's two others that I'm going to forget. Todd, do you recall offhand?
I was just going to look at it. It's a diameter diversity index, stand age, trees per acre over 30 inches diameter, and top height of the stand.
Right. So of those variables, how well does FVS predict the diameter diversity index?
So, that as Nick alluded to, that we need to dig into that a little bit with regard to the HSIs, but the work that we did to calibrate FVS at the diameter class level, that first slide that I showed, was intended to improve the diameter estimation coming out of FVS. So
Yeah, but that diameter diversity index is driven heavily by the number of small trees.
Correct.
And so, so I can just simply relay that in my experience, FVS doesn't do a very good job generating DDIs. And so there's a high degree of uncertainty in your HSI results if you're using FVS to drive that that model result. And so when I look at this chart, those bars above the dashed line are a hedge against that uncertainty.
Yeah, they're also, I mean, to be clear, from the services perspective, if I may speak on their behalf, which I shouldn't, it's not that that baseline commitment is sort of the floor. They're interested in the network. The habitat commit, the numeric commitment is not like the critical measure for the adequacy of the habitat conservation area network. And so from their perspective, they're not looking at that number saying, is that enough? They're looking at the full package. And there are risks, you know, should you reduce the HCAs, they'd be looking elsewhere and achieve a full package. So
quick follow-up, Nick, the network is indeed important. That includes the dispersal habitat. And it is important to recognize that this HCP is not designed to recover a species. It is designed to keep things from getting worse. So these additional acres that are above that dashed line are part of that network and are designed to not make the populations go down in any way.
Thank you. And Vice Chair Scar?
Thank you very much. We really appreciate the opportunity to be in the conversation with you all. And I was going to shift just a little bit because this habitat piece, I think, is one that we're sort of grabbing a hold of because we're looking at Board Member Chambers' comment to the reduction in revenue and just wondering how the department is going to be able to function with what appears to be about a 25% drop in revenue. If you look at the 10-year average and then you look at what's projected in here, how will we continue to operate? So I think we focused in on this habitat thinking, could we find the ability to operate in there, both the counties and the state? Because as we look at this plan and look at whether or not it's the right plan in the right way, can we keep tweaking it? What do we do here? What are you thinking, I guess, as a board and as the department about how you will operate on 30% or 25% less revenue over the long haul? That's a concern that I have when I look at the model and what numbers it gives us.
I should probably answer that or try to. You know, one of the things about the board's position as a policy board is we do not control the purse strings for the department. So what that means, you know, if we have reduced funding, money coming out of the forest for our budget, that short of the legislature acting, all we can do is reduce. Essentially, it's mostly people, and that's what Cal would have to do unless the legislature acts. It's not under our control. I was struck in one of the questions that you county folks presented to Mike. I was struck by his answer, which I think, Mike, you can clarify, that to cover the cost of management of the forest, we'd have to be harvesting at a much higher level than we ever have. So, you know, I've never been able to get this question answered to whether or not the department today, whether the cost of managing the forest is covered by the what we get out of the formula or not. It sounds from your answer, and correct me if I'm wrong, that already we're not covering the cost through our 1/3 of the management of those forests, which, if that's true, that means already the taxpayers of Oregon are subsidizing these forests. Is that true, Mike?
I wouldn't say that the taxpayers of Oregon are subsidizing that, because we just take budget cuts and we do less. And what it results in is less than full implementation of the forest management plan. And we've known for quite some time that we don't have a revenue stream that adequately covers full implementation of even our current forest management plan. Two things, just for clarity, so that everybody's on the same page, our 10.
Giovanni, can you turn that off?
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
So, okay. So, what I was, sorry, messed up my view here. Hold on. So, yeah, basically, just so everybody's on the same page, our 10-year average revenue to the department from timber sale harvest has been $38.16 million a year. Under the scenario 1 district scale, or under the geo region, it's almost identical. It's $27 million a year. Our budget more recently has been $42 million a year or thereabouts. $11 million of that is beyond our control. So, we are already and have been for quite a while in a situation where we don't cover our own, our revenues do not cover our expenses. One thing that I would like to just, point out, though, and I pointed this out many times, we've gone through severe austerity measures in order to make that work. And so we had many unfilled positions. We shifted our harvest pattern towards high net revenue sales, which caused us to shift to sales that did not require much project work and also had higher value timber, in some cases older timber, which caused consternation with some folks. But anyway, we managed to build the FDF back up by having, through 2018 through 2019, we had very high years, 47 million and almost 54 million revenues returned to ODF. So high years for both us and the county. So our ships rise and fall together, but absolutely you are correct, Chair Kelly. Over the long term, we always face this problem of having to severely cut into whatever services that we're providing to Oregonians in order to stay solvent.
So quick follow-up in terms of implementing the HCP at this loss, are we actually able to do what we are promising to do for the services if we have to cut at that level of austerity, or are we putting even the HCP and its implementation in danger by the very work of the HCP at this point?
I think that is a perfectly legitimate question. I think that there is some danger there. And I think, my personal solution to that, my personal opinion on what we need to do is actually be seeking alternative funding sources to help stabilize the ship and be able to pay for implementation of, all of our operations under any policy context. But yeah, that definitely presents a big challenge.
Great, thanks, Mike. And I know we just have a limited amount of time for conversation. I want to make sure we're talking about the things that are important. This might be a, name the concerns and move on conversation. I think that was an important one, is the drop in revenue and what that means for operations and even the HCP itself. We did have a few other questions that we want to get to, but I also want to, make sure we get to the hands up that still have comments on the modeling results itself and reflections there. So I'll go to member Joe Justice, and then maybe we can get back to the other slide questions.
Yeah, so real quick, just a comment on modeling. I've worked my career in dealing with models, and calibration is a part of the process. We've accepted calibration related to harvest estimates, and we've also done calibration to look at estimates of habitat being developed. And so specifically, there was some question regarding estimates of diameters and diameter distributions. I heard in the presentation that we have modified estimated growth rates of different diameter classes as calibration. So I just want to point that out. That's just a comment. I think it was, these models are certainly imperfect, but the work being done to calibrate is very important. And it's also based on FIA data. So, which is a perfectly appropriate way by which to be calibrating your models. So I think we need to, these are tools that are to inform us, and we calibrate them, and it's based on data. So I would just make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Do you mind putting the slides back up for the next set of questions? There's a lot of words here, but these are dense, important questions that that were important for the conversation. And it sounded like FTLAC members sort of have ideas of who's speaking to each one. So the next question is really about, the forest management plan and the HCP were really a mechanism with the HCP is a mechanism to mitigate some of the legal risks, as opposed to take avoidance, and really to get that public support to manage the state forests. So just wanted to see what your perception is of these risks, and how the FMP and HCP are responding. So is there an FTLAC member that wanted to handle this question?
Yes, Commissioner Bangs, Clatsop County. In response, we see that the HCP is a method for complying with the Endangered Species Act. We think it's necessary for ODF to get an HCP considering the costly litigation that could occur. However, we see clear standards under which an applicant can receive an incidental take permit. And that's described in the Federal Services HCP handbook. ODF has still yet to explain to what extent the HCP meets those standards, or why there is a need to conserve 70% more habitat than needed to meet the HCP commitments inside the HCAs. The excess habitat doesn't even include the suitable habitat outside of the HCAs as seen by the previous graph. When we look at the FMP, honestly, we don't see that the FMP substantially reduces risk. Arguably, the past FMPs have actually increased risk by pushing ODF to develop endangered species habitat without coverage of an HCP. So no matter what the FMP says, there is a risk that no one group or another won't support the management of the state forests. We know ODF needs an FMP to guide planning, but an FMP does not stop costly litigation. So those are our thoughts just in regard to the HCP and FMP conversation that we're having here today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Bangs. And others, any reflections on Commissioner Bangs' thoughts there? Maybe board members?
So I guess in hearing that, Commissioner Bangs, what would your recommendation be on moving forward? How are you thinking from what you're seeing here about risk? Because this HCP is to mitigate risk, and I think what I heard from your comment was you feel like it may not be, but yet an HCP is something you feel that is still desirable. What path forward would you recommend?
So honestly, it's clear from the data presented by ODF in the modeling report that the HCP well exceeds the conservation commitments. This gives, I feel, ODF the flexibility to reduce the impacts on our counties without undermining achievement of the conservation goals in the HCP. I hope that the board takes this opportunity to direct ODF to reduce the impacts on our counties while the opportunity still exists. What that looks like, I'm sure that we can discuss in the future, but always with the reminder that there is that iterative tool within the HCP that allows us to be responsible and allows us to be responsive to potential future conditions. So those are my thoughts. Like, we have a little bit of time, so let's take that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner and Member Justice. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, go ahead, Member Dumlin.
Thank you. Just, this is sort of a follow-up, but we've sort of lost the threads on sort of the no action alternative, that I feel like from previous reports and sessions we've sort of talked about and the comparative analysis had the no action alternative of sort of what's take avoidance look like. And I don't know if the department might, not necessarily today, but in the future, be able to speak to sort of the current thinking on that. From my perspective, I'm pretty afraid of the no action alternative, and I appreciate that, Commissioner Banks, you were not suggesting that. You were suggesting that we keep an HCP of some form going forward, but I didn't want to lose track of that when we're managing risk here, and that any changes to this HCP incur its own risk, and what I have in the back of my mind is if we don't have an HCP, and from my perspective, have bigger problems. These numbers would probably look even worse. So just a thought and a comment.
Thank you.
I'd like to add to that. I think the question that has dogged us for years is this particular HCP giving away too much for conservation? And that question continues to dog us, and we're not able to answer it very well. I think the reality is, that could only really be tested in a process that would be push us into a supplemental EIS that is likely 3+ years of and involves a tremendous amount of risk. We might not be successful with a new version that would reduce HCAs and that kind of thing. So our real question, I think, for the counties is, and we have a Coho lawsuit that sits out there that if we do not have an HCP is back in action. Other lawsuits, we have a retrieval listing potentially coming up next month. So, the real question, I think, is how much, for us all to discuss, is how much risk, knowing that going forward with this has serious consequences. How much risk do we all want to look at in terms of going after a supplemental EIS and putting this out years into the future?
Thank you, Chair Kelly. And Commissioner Banks?
Yeah, I just had a brief response. The overcommitment that the counties are seeing and addressing, I think, abundantly right now is neither the coho or the retrieval. It is mainly the owl HCA commitments. And when we look at the size of our HCAs and when we look at our communities, we recognize that those HCAs have acres within them that are not habitat and will not reach habitat age by the end of the term. So HCAs don't actually equate to habitat for many of our communities. Granted, you see in those graphs, there's abundant habitat there. And that's not actually a good correlation to our actual HCA size. So I'm not sure if I'm verbalizing this in the best manner possible, but
No, fair point.
it's just these owl HCAs have well displayed an overcommitment to a species that on its own, even with all of the federal lands that are dedicated to it, is still not a successful species itself. And so what the counties are reflecting on is no matter how many more acres we throw at this species, we don't think that we may be able to save it. And so I would like a similar consideration to my community of the school districts, the fire departments, our rural law enforcement. They deserve to have a chance of success. And so I just hope that we can give equal attention to what this commitment in the OWL HCAs would mean. So thank you.
Commissioner. Well, maybe we can move in. I think that's a good segue into the next question and thinking about, how the board and the FTLAC want to continue to collaborate and think about these important questions and kind of find solutions to manage public forest in the context of greatest permanent value, and these other important considerations that have come up. Was there an FTLAC member that wanted to speak to that question?
Yes, this Commissioner Sweet. Yeah, my testimony is about working together. We must continue to understand each other's differences, accept them, try our very, very best to work our way through those, and so we can successfully manage our county forests. Understanding greatest permanent value is really a challenging thing. We really need to understand what GPV means so we can work together to get there. We know that GPV is defined in an OAR as a few different things, but they are not in any specific order. It would be great for counties to know from the board how they are considering greatest permanent value each year. But as far as engagement, this is something we want to improve. We've seen our relationship with the board and department improve over time. At least we feel that way. We want to keep that going. As the new chair of the Council of Forest Trust Lands, as well as the chair of the Forest Trust Land Advisory Committee, board members, I want to make sure you know you are always invited to the Forest Trust Land Advisory Council meetings. Chair Kelly, you attend our meetings, and we are very, very appreciative of that. However, our table is available for all of the members of this board. We would love to see other board members as well. The meetings provide an opportunity for commissioners to engage with staff to understand better key planning issues and provide input to the department. In addition, counties have a representative on the State Forest Advisory Committee. Our representative is Commissioner Magruder of Columbia County. We have only one representative on that committee, even though counties have a range of interests in state forests. Having one or two more representatives would certainly help. The thing you have to remember is that commissioners don't just represent one interest, be it industry, environmental, recreation, or what have you. We represent everyone that lives in our counties. This includes folks that care about all these issues, as well as folks that depend on county services for health, safety, or other services, even if they have never visited a state forest. We assure you we want to continue engaging with the board, the Oregon Department of Forestry, and stakeholders on any issue that affects greatest permanent value at board meetings, at FTLAC meetings, at SFAC meetings, and in our communities.
Commissioner Sweet, I just want to make one point, which is at my encouragement, we had a number of board members at your last meeting. I don't think you guys were aware that they were attending. Maybe in the future we could make them into panelists or whatever so that everyone's aware that they were actually there, but there were a number of board members.
Thank you, Jim. We'd love that. Really would.
Okay, thank you, Chair Sweet. And Member Carla Chambers.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Sweet. You know, I just want to, that greatest permanent value in the second page of the documentation we received today. It means healthy, productive, and sustainable forest ecosystems that over time and across the landscape provide a full range of social, economic, and environmental benefits to the people of Oregon. And I feel like this is stronger in some areas, but exceedingly weak in others. This is a $6 billion asset that belongs to the people of Oregon. And we don't pay interest and principal payments on this like any private forest would. So the fact that we are going from, you know, a period of profits and returns and benefit to the counties and to the, you know, Department of Forestry to a period of losses, I think that demands all of our attention. And, you know, Chairman Sweet, we were told not to attend your meetings because of quorum. I attended all of them until we were really advised not to. So I'd like to find a way to deal with that, because I think you bring phenomenal perspective and guidance, and we need that teamwork and that leadership. So I would like to, you know, to work around that and figure out a solution to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla.
Thank you. The others, any other, you know, comments or suggestions or just ways that you all want to collaborate together and you know, work on finding these solutions together? Maybe anything that's been working well or that you want to do differently? And Justin, we got a request to take the slides down, so if you don't mind doing that. Commissioner Banks?
Yeah, just in regards to collaboration, when this entire thing started, we were not allowed to collaborate. And if we explore companion EIS, I would love for the counties to be able to collaborate. So that is all that I will say on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and Cal Makamoto?
Yeah. First off, Commissioner Bangs, I think thank you for acknowledging that we need an HCP, and because it is, you know, a stability, and I'm glad it's acknowledged, and because that's the reason why I want to. When you look at the revenue situation, you look at the department, stability is where we need to be at, and I guess it gets down to that comparison against take avoidance and an HCP. Refining that discussion even more, I think bringing forth the idea that we're overgrowing habitat, you know, especially for the northern spotted owl. And can that be redistributed to the counties for their social needs? I mean, I'm just simplifying, but that's kind of the question. And, you know, when I look at this and my experience, just like Joe, I'm an older forester, so I've probably done this more often, and I know about the uncertainties. And John, you're a forester, so you know about this stuff too. I'm
not older, I'm oldest.
And that's why I respect you, John. So, you know, these heuristics that are used to determine this growth model on the habitat, and I think Brenda commented on that, is that there's a certain amount of uncertainty, and I don't know how the services view that. And I think we need to be looking at that and bringing the counties along with our understanding of how those heuristics are working, and do we really have that much margin? So I think it's worth discussing the heuristics, but I also think that I also go live by another model in my business, is that time kills all deals. And are we at bigger risk allowing time to kill a deal, or are we better off, or do we have the time? And so I think, Commissioner Banks, I heard you say we have the time. to look at that, we'll be thinking about that. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Others, any other comments, thoughts on collaboration, or even this concept of time and how much time we may really have to make a path forward?
I'd like to share just some of my takeaways from the modeling, in trying to look at the big picture. I mean, one thing that we knew this to a certain extent, but the modeling really brought to the fore of the difference, how this affects different counties so differently. And with Washington County and Clatsop County most significantly affected. And of course, that's much tougher for Clatsop County than Washington County in terms of their whole budget. So that's very real. The other thing is that, I think in general, we hear all the caveats, but I think we are looking at better, more up-to-date modeling than we ever have. And so that's a good thing. But part of that story is that the trees have not been growing as fast. We hear all the lingo, but some of what that boils down to, particularly in Tillamook Forest, is that we don't have as much tree growth as we thought we had. That's not good for any of us. That's not good for the department. That's not good for the counties. And of course, the fact that it's been brought up that the modeling doesn't include future disturbance, fire, climate change, also not good for any of us and for the county. So there's not a lot of good news here. And with the current funding formula, there's not good news for the department. There's no good news here for the counties. And any version of this HCP, even if we were to go for 3 years and do a supplemental EIS, it's still not going to be good news for the counties or for the department. It might be a little bit better, but it's not going to be great news. And of course, not having an ACP is not a solution. I think we're all getting closer to agreement on that. The take avoidance approach, it puts us down a very bad road. So, we can work on more modeling, and that's better to a point. We will never be in a point where the board can make a decision where we have a lot of certainty. But I think, what is certain is that following the current funding model in any scenario is not a road to success for either the department or for the counties.
Okay, thank you, Chair Kelly. And Member Dwimling?
Thank you. Jim took some of my thunder. I appreciate that perspective, Jim. I just wanted to sort of personally, we as the board, and I'll speak for myself personally as a board member, I hear your testimony, commissioners, regularly, and I hear it loud and clear, and I appreciate it. And I think sometimes it may feel like the board members or I would just sort of sit there quietly listening and don't really respond. That's in no way, shape, or form should be an indication that I'm not listening and I don't appreciate and understand the concerns and the challenges. And Commissioner Tucker, I hear you loud and clear. What are these jobs worth? What are we losing these jobs for? And managing these trade-offs. And so I have very little disagreement with anybody in this Zoom room on the challenges ahead of us and that are in front of us right now. And exactly how to thread that needle, sort of like Jim said, of how to find the right recipe for the forest and the counties in the state of Oregon is one that I think we all are wrestling with and individually and trying to figure out. So I just, there's some disagreement in this room on the right path forward, but I really, personally, I don't think that there's any disagreement on the challenges in front of us. Just wanted to sort of put that out there and appreciate this conversation and look forward to more of these.
Thank you. And let's go to Commissioner Bangs, and then we did have one last question, and maybe we can go to that one. So Commissioner Bangs.
I just wanted to make note that I appreciate the contemplation and the thought process and the hesitancy that you are all exhibiting in this discussion of whether or not moving forward or waiting additional years or so on and so forth. I just when it all circles back to my community, I look at my students and I look at their families, and I just hope that you are all willing to take the risk to improve upon the product that we have right now so that we can minimize our future impacts when we all of us, counties and the Department of Forestry, are going to need to go to legislature with our hand out looking for assistance in moving forward. So if we can shrink the amount that we are all looking for, I think that we will all probably find better success. So those are just my thoughts. Thank you.
Sylvia, just before you go to that next question, I'll just give you a time check here. We've got 8 minutes left. I know that Cal wants to talk for a couple of minutes about the next steps to sum up at the end of the meeting here. So we've really got about 4 minutes for this next question.
That's great. So maybe for the next question, we can just hear from the FTLAC member that was planning to address this one. And if you want a quick slide up again, really just asking, and thank you, Commissioner Bangs, you laid out some of the challenges for the counties really well just now. So how can the board and ODF support the counties outside of the FMP to kind of mitigate any potential impacts as a result of the FMP with HCP? So FTLAC members.
Sure, thank you.
And please take the slide down again for conversation.
Yeah, sure. This is Commissioner Scar from Tillamook. So I will try to be somewhat brief. The biggest things that I've heard today as we're talking about this model is it has uncertainty and we're trying to figure that out. But there's the FMP and the IP and pieces where we will be actually working on the ground. We have adaptive management to work with. But in order for us to work together for that to feel effective and responsive, it will be building trust, which is what we're working on doing here today. So when we talk about how we can work together in the implementation, assuming that the HCP is tweaked to the best of its ability and moves forward, it's these kind of conversations. It's building this trust. It's as it's time to put this into practice on the ground, having us at the table, asking us, hey, here's what it looks like in your community. Is there a way we can move left, move right? Can we work together on this? I think that's going to be super, super important. Somebody, I think it was Commissioner Bangs, referenced that ask at the legislature. If this goes forward, and maybe even if it doesn't, we're all going to find ourselves at the legislature with our hands out, making a very hopefully strong case for why the forests are so important to everyone in this state, that people who have yet to put a dime into it from their taxes, because it all came out of harvest, now have to revisit their own relationship with the forest and help pay for it. And that's going to happen by all of us working together, by having a very compelling new narrative around our forests, around greatness, permanent value, around how we work together and how we walk arm in arm, because we all believe in the same things. And so that's the steps we're taking to start today. It's the steps that we really need to take. So thank you for the meeting. Thank you for the conversation, the opportunity to do this. We ask you to look hard at making it the best you can for counties, to Commissioner Bangs' point, so that the ask that we are making is as small as possible, and then all of us working together to craft that new narrative together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner Scar. And I know we're short on time here. I just want to appreciate all of the collaboration and the listening and, the clear desire to have these conversations together today. I know we're going to Cal in just a moment. David Yamamoto, I see your hand up, so I'm just going to look at others. If Jim Kelly, I'll look to you if we have time for that. One more comment.
Sure.
Please, David Yamamoto.
Thank you so much. Do appreciate it very much. Good afternoon, Chair Kelly, State Forester Mukomoto, Board of Forestry members. I know you probably thought you finally gotten rid of me, But I do appreciate that Chair Kelly allowed me to address this board one final time as past chair. For the record, I am Tillamook County Commissioner Dave Yamamoto. It's truly a pleasure to see all of you again. You know, we've been talking about this HCP for a long time. Over the years, we've asked for a seat at the negotiation table time and time again, and unfortunately didn't get one. We have continued to watch harvest levels fall time and time again through each stage of planning. The business case analysis, the comparative analysis, the draft EIS, we now have what the department says are the most accurate harvest projections we've seen, though they admit to not having adequate time and resources to do the job, do the best job possible. In addition, I implore this board to inquire about and determine the true consequences of what Mike Rolson refers to as the Tillamook problem and how this affects the Tillamook harvest levels. Regardless of the questions raised by this problem, this newest modeling is not good for the counties. Some options might be good for individual counties, but overall, the projections are far below past projections and past actual harvest. They are bad for counties, they are bad for our special districts, and they are bad for fully benefited family wage jobs. Board members, you have continually asked us about the impact to our counties, and we have described these impacts in detail. You have asked us to wait for better models, and we now have the new modeling, though not perhaps better. Board members, what is your path forward now? I ask you to consider, is this HCP the best we can do? Does this HCP provide certainty and reduce risk? Is this HCP good for Oregon and Oregonians? Almost entirely at the expense of the trust counties and our residents. Chair Kelly, I appreciate you're offering me this time to speak, this one last time to the board. And board members, I wish you all the best moving forward. I know you've got a very tough job in front of you. Thank you.
Commissioner.
Okay. Cal, you've got a few things to tell us?
Okay, well, first off, I want to thank everybody for attending this meeting. I know it takes a lot of time, there's a lot of numbers, and these are difficult decisions, as Commissioner Yamamoto has stated. And thank you, David, for your service. I appreciate that. One of the things I wanted to point out is that we're going to go out and try to gather more information from Oregonians after we've let this model out, and hopefully listen to them. We will have listening posts, 2 in person, and I think 1 virtually. We're thinking, and I'm hoping that we can get those announced and organized before the end of January. But prior to that, we need to also reach out to our recognized sovereign nations, the tribes, and get their input on this, because they are affected also, especially on the coast. We have a lot of tribes that are directly affected by this. And so I'm looking forward. I really appreciate, I heard a lot of people coming closer together today, and their discussion in the comments. I think that instead of being oppositional, I want to see us on this, find out what, I think we all need to get in the same baseball field. And I think and talk about this together. And I'm looking forward to learning and bringing more information to our board so they can make a most informed decision. So thank you.
Okay, with that, I would want to congratulate all of you. Sylvia, thank you for helping us through this. But I've been in many Forest Trust Land Advisory Committee meetings, and this, I think, what we really did a great job of hearing each other and dealing with each other respectfully. And I'm really impressed with all of you. So thank you all. And with that, I will adjourn this special meeting of the Oregon Board of Forestry. Bye, everybody.